Compliance is a lot of work, and compliance is really easy to sidestep when you're little and on nobody's radar.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Optimized Podcast, brought to you by VisibleThread. I'm your host, Jeff Shapiro. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited. I know I keep saying that for every guest, but this one is especially meaningful to me. This is a longtime friend, and I'm allowed to say former client as well. Donna Honeycutt, welcome to the Optimized Podcast.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here on your podcast.
Love it. So I did Donna's podcast a number of years ago, so I'm really glad that she's returning the favor for me a number of years later. So let me give you a quick bio of Donna for those of you listening who do not know her. Donna was a co-founder and chief operating officer of WWC Global. Donna's had the privilege of testifying to Congress about the impacts of regulation on small businesses. Donna is very active within the National Defense Industrial Association and has won multiple awards from that organization. Donna sits on a number of different defense-related boards as well as philanthropic organizations. Since the sale of WWC Global in 2022, Donna has become a strategic advisor to a number of different companies. And like I said, I'm thrilled to have you here, Donna, and I know you've got a lot to offer to those listening who are in and around the government contracting community. But before we get into that, we got to start out, I didn't talk in your bio that you actually started out in a law firm. You got your JD, started out with a law firm. You weren't even doing government contracting stuff.
Yeah.
How does this happen?
Yeah. So how does this happen? I started off, I was doing private equity, and then I fell in love. I was doing private equity in New York. I fell in love with a sailor who you happen to know. You went to school with him.
I did.
And then this started something that I never expected, a totally wild ride. Very long story that I think military-affiliated families would appreciate. He was supposed to get his next tour in Massachusetts, where I was happily employed as an attorney looking to make partner, happily ensconced. He was told, you are definitely going to get your first choice because you won this, and that award. And in classic military style, they came back and said, oh, guess what? You're going abroad. And so we packed up all our things. My firm said, hey, why don't you work, 2 weeks here, 2 weeks in Italy. And this was before people were working on the internet. And I said, I don't see that happening financially and logistically. So I found myself in Naples, Italy, had to abandon my firm, didn't know what I was going to do next. Started teaching some courses in the local MBA program that was run at the time by University of Phoenix with a friend, and we would switch off the baton. Together we taught an entire MBA curriculum. We graduated an entire class. And then in terms of employment, there was not much on the base. I heard, well, you're a military spouse and you're a lawyer. You could be a legal secretary. And it just, frankly, wasn't worth my time. I was going to write a novel. Never happened. Still have the novel inside me. Then the friend that I was teaching with got a contract on the base, and I had just had a baby.
No.
So this is actually a feminist story, because here I am in Italy, having moved because of my husband's career that was determinative of where we were going to live. He was an active duty troop, an active duty sailor, and had this colicky baby. And I had this very cranky Ukrainian cleaning lady who, she could have been out of like a Grimm's fairy tale. She had a very sour face and very unhappy person. And every time I would bring my colicky baby around her, she would just bloom. And all of a sudden she looked 20 years younger, and she was just this happy person. And I thought, you know what, I need this woman to be my nanny, because what happened was my friend wanted me to work with her and start this company. And so we worked in 8-hour shifts. And I said, listen, I'll do whatever you want as long as you pay me enough to afford this nanny. So the nanny would come, knock on my door. She lived in my apartment, knock on the door at 8 o'clock in the morning, take the howling baby from my hands, keep the howling baby until 12 when I would wake up, and I would work until like 8 o'clock at night. 8 o'clock at night, she'd hand the baby over. I'd stay up with the howling baby 8 o'clock at night till 8 o'clock in the morning, rinse and repeat. So that was how I started. That's how I started the company.
Incredible. All right. So you're obviously alluding to the founding of WWC Global. Like, how,
Yes.
You're overseas, you're in Italy.
Yeah.
How do you find a business? You're Americans in Italy.
Yes.
I mean, obviously you're on a Navy base, so I guess that must have been some of the inspiration. Like, how does this start? Is there enough information on the internet on how to found a government contractor?
Well, so, my business partner was married to a government contracting officer. So was getting, all this information about how that worked. I had the legal background and the financial background to be able to review contracts, to be able to do, I didn't actually price out our first contracts, but really just to be able to do stuff without getting into too much trouble, frankly. And, honestly, I think anybody with that background would have been able to do it. And it was just this fantastic opportunity that we fell into. But as it happened, my husband was a Navy nuclear officer. So everyone in his squadron, all of these Navy nukes and a lot of the surface warfare officers were engineers, and they were there with their spouses. And at the time, spouses were very much put in a box, right? Everybody expected you to be with a white picket fence and holding down the home front and everything. And that is because the admirals who were in charge at the time on this base and the Air Force generals and such, they had these wives that were basically dedicated to supporting their career. That was the expectation of wives at the time. And we were some of the first wives that, and it was all wives, right, for the submarine squadron, because at the time they didn't have women on the submarines. It was all wives that were well educated because, look, we're all married to engineers. So there were a lot of us lawyers, there were a lot of MBAs, a lot of very, very bright, very talented women who were being told, like me, you could work at the Next, you can be a paralegal. And the difference is not only were they educated, we were the first generation that also had student loans. And this was, I think, a really critical dynamic, a financial dynamic that went unrecognized within the military, right? This is right after 9/11. This was 2004 that I had gone over to Naples. Nobody was really aware of the fact that there's going to be a retention problem if the active duty troops have to leave because the wives are saying, listen, I need to actualize my career and I need to pay down my student debt. It was a completely new, not only cultural world for military families, but a new fiscal world for military families. Now, not to take away from any military spouses that stay home and keep the home, which is way harder than I could ever do. But in reality, whoever had this debt, I mean, that was a really driving trajectory. And as you recall, in 2004, 2005, they were starting to augment people, for example, from the Navy to go to Iraq. So my husband was, potentially going to be an individual augmentee, go, tote a rifle in Iraq. And so these were the times under which we were being asked, do you want to re-up? And I think the military was a little bit behind the curve on doing that. They ended up paying tremendous bonuses for people to re-up in the middle of this. And this was really when they were, taking everybody that they could into the sandbox.
Yep. Yeah.
So to make a very long story short, we provided an opportunity for the military spouses to stay engaged career-wise, to continue to exercise their professional skills, to actually do something. And really importantly, to have a community, because potentially, essentially out there in Naples, we were all scattered, to the winds, right? The military housing was full. People were out living on the economy. You didn't quite meet the other spouses. Yeah, you didn't meet the other spouses unless you were engaged in something sort of charitable. But we started a company that was made up all of military spouses, and the caliber of talent that was on ground was unbelievable and not recognized by HRO. So HRO at that time, they had a rule that anyone that was a GS9 and above, any of those positions had to be advertised stateside. And then you would have to basically export American talent from the United States with the logistical support. So if you think about it, moving all their furniture, paying for the Dodd schools, all of this, they really were not aware that they already had these skill sets on the ground. So these nuclear submarine and SWO spouses, again, MBAs, we had all of the skill set that you needed actually to run the business functions on the base. So it was a really beautiful sort of conflation of circumstances and easy solutions that had been overlooked that we managed to leverage and build really a new culture. It was a new culture in business as well. We really started this just because we wanted jobs. And when we brought along the other military spouses, and of course, eventually it grew to be a lot of men, it grew to be veterans, it grew to be a lot of different types of employees. But in these early years, we were all military spouses. We were all sort of white-knuckling it through the various PCSs, through the long deployments. And we built this fantastic culture that was way more than just a company. It was never intended to be a big money-making venture. It was intended to sustain itself and give us all things to do during the day.
I love it. So before we get a little bit more into the growth story, let's keep talking about the founding story a bit. So how did you get that first contract? Like, was it through your husband? Was it through someone else you knew on base? Be like, hey, me and my founder, we know how to do these skills. Can we help you with this task?
Right.
Like, how does that come about? Like, this is well before SAN.gov. This is, FPDS, I guess, was going on, but
yeah,
I'm sure this was not found via FPDS. It was boots on the ground, right?
Yes.
You were there.
Well, you have to remember that there was a tremendous need for talent on the ground, right? Because the demands and the demand signal was growing by the day. The command, so this was an installations command, right? And it used to be the Europe installations command, and that it absorbed the Africa and Southwest Asia installations function. So as a result, we had the world changing dramatically as a result of 9/11. We had bases being stood down in Europe. We had bases being stood up temporarily and then later became baseline. In Africa, we were absorbing Southwest Asia. There was a tremendous need for business talent, and everybody on base was hungry for it. And the easiest way to do it, particularly with the streams of funding that were coming down, were through the war on terror funding, right? Because you didn't really have to justify it. People were getting large chunks of money within the different encodes and saying, hey, oh my God, thank God I could hire, another pair of hands to help me out with that. So enter the military spouses. We got our first contract through my business partner's friend. She said, hey, you know how to do, policy, right? Come on board. And she did. And before she started, there was the need for a half-time person to basically manage the inventory of all of the resources on the installation. And so she brought me on board, and I made this very, very, very complicated Excel product account that was sent out routinely rather than, on fire data calls, right? So there are too many data calls. So this is basically an Excel product of which different spreadsheets were sent out monthly to each of the constituent commands, and they had to report on things like, their FEMA resources, their military working dogs, their hardware, whatever it is that needed to be called up in the event of emergency and in the event of mobilizing it another way.
Sure.
And of course, the intent was to stop the incessant data calls that made everybody drop everything and try to answer the general or the admiral. So that was the first product we did. As soon as we did that, we got requests from more people because it was such an easy solution. It was so cheap compared to the usual process. It was incredibly fast compared to the hiring process and having to get a new billet. And even if you had a billet, having to hire within that billet and then having to publicize stateside and then having to move somebody over. We had a very, very hungry labor pool that was dying to do things. And so we were able to offer that labor pool, in particular, junior level labor, which was really hard to bring over, right? because you really needed pairs of hands and you needed someone with a good analytical brain to do stuff. You really didn't need them to be so specialized. You could show them what they were doing. And I mean, these women were unbelievable. At this time, of course, it was women. They already had the analytical skill sets. And the way that HRO was hiring was you need to have worked with, X digital product before. You need to have worked with this system before. Well, it wasn't relevant. You had people that had done that weren't really very analytical or weren't great communicators. What we did was we were able, as contractors, to recruit people that had these transitive skills, right? If you had great financial skills and you had great organizational skills and you had great communication skills, you really could learn the financial systems on base without too much trouble. And so this was sort of a kind of a trick for the business offices on base to staff themselves with really capable people. And it got to the point, it was really funny, where HROs started noticing. And they, everyone on the base assumed that all of a sudden you started seeing women in business suits on the base. And people started to assume that any woman in a business suit was one of ours, and which was a huge compliment, frankly.
That's amazing.
They liked us. We weren't threatening. That was the other thing. We weren't threatening. We were wives, right? I mean, how could we possibly be a threat to any of the military professionals on base? So they loved us. And a lot of the business offices really depended on us to be, objective sounding boards and to really make things go. And eventually HRO noticed and they changed their own rules. They started making it possible to hire military dependents on ground and right into the offices. And so once we did that, our company grew exponentially because we sort of had the magic sauce about how to do that with the work authorizations and such. We were very responsible. We were very fast. We had the people on the ground, and they were all of very, very high quality. So we really benefited, I think, from that sort of crucible of the situation at the time and the need for good labor. And the undertapped labor pool, of course.
Yeah, you essentially had the monopoly. You obviously created a community there in Naples. You knew everyone quickly, and you knew everyone's skill set. You had recruited everyone before they realized that there was a company that could support the organization, the command there. So that's incredibly impressive. And
that's exactly right.
Yeah. So
we were very, very fortunate, and as a result, I have to say, we benefited from it, but I would say that the way we benefited from it the most, we were certainly first to market. We were first to recognize the undertapped labor pool. We were first to make it work with the work authorizations. I think we were, and I do think to some degree the fact that we were women was one of our superpowers because, again, we weren't threatening. Nobody was scared of us. Nobody thought we were trying to get something out of them. And in fact, we weren't. We were trying to find good positions for good people. So we had the benefit of really not having to answer to shareholders, not really, as long as it was self-sustaining and we made a salary, we were fine. But it was really a crucible in which you could start a business because, again, those free cash flows coming from, the war on terror, the dire need, the fantastic labor pool on ground. And what that ended up doing for us later on as we grew is, so we were OCONAs, we were outside the continental United States. Our clients moved around. We got more contracts in other countries. And as they moved around, they would bring us to their new command. It was a wonderful situation. And our dream was, we wanted to be able to just provide enough jobs for the military spouses that wanted the jobs. But what ended up happening was we ended up able to provide careers for the military spouses, and not just jobs, not just pocket money, right? We ended up over the course of 18 years promoting and sharing partnership with military spouses. For a long time, we were exclusively staffed by military spouses. So, our third partner started off as I think, junior mid-level analyst. Our second hire, who was a Yale and Harvard trained attorney, is still director of contracts over now with this conglomerate that bought us. And we benefited from having an amazing farm team that allowed us to really identify. And I have to say that the military spouses were, on average, way above and beyond any kind of workforce. I mean, the statistics on this bear it out. Military spouses, as you know, they're positive, they are optimistic, they are can-do, they are flexible, and they have grit, and they don't stop. And a lot of them have a tremendous amount of charm and have learned how, to use that to patiently within a very bureaucratic system. We got the benefit of all of that. And we got the best of those military spouses, and it grew the company really fast.
Incredible. So how did you know you finally had a company? It's like, I need to now organize a formal culture. I need policies and procedures. I need to start a back office here. I can't no longer process the invoices myself. When does that inflection point happen, and what do you do about that?
So I was the back office until we had about 12 employees. And then we realized that we needed those functions to be robust and substantial. There are a lot of requirements once you start to get into the FAR and the way that all of these government systems work that really require someone being on top of them. They require a lot of routinization, a lot of codification, a lot of policies. So at about 12 employees, I started really doing this full time as the back office. And it grew from there. And you feel it. I mean, there are these breaking points. I think 12 was a breaking point, right? And not uncoincidentally, it was the same point at which we had a sufficient amount of revenue to support that, to support someone being overhead. Once you get to know, as you know so well, Jeff, the DCAA accounting standards, you know that there really is a lot of logic in how they interact. So, you'll see it on the balance sheet as well. And if you don't, you're doing things wrong. That at these certain breaking points, 12 employees, maybe 30, maybe 50, maybe 80, 100, you need to reorganize. And, one thing that what people that don't understand what management is, they say, well, what do these people do? They sit around all day. I think once they get into management, they go, oh, okay. Because managing is not just making sure that the trains run on time, right? It is constantly reconfiguring. It is constantly rewriting. It is constantly reassigning. It is constantly reallocating resources. And, a company can't just stay where it is. It has to either grow or die. That's just the way the world works. And so as a result, if you're doing well, you're growing. And that means you are reconfiguring all the time. You are, and I have a mentor who gave me some great advice. He said, an executive has just 3 functions. The first function is to lead the vision. The second function is to allocate resources, including their own time, including money, including jobs, all of it. And the third is to train the next people underneath them to come up and take over and to train the next generation. And so we were engaged in that process for the next 18 years.
Yeah, it's been really impressive. So growing, policymaking, you were growing you said the different bases. You were still based in Italy. How long did that last in Italy before you ended up coming stateside and then realizing I got a big thing here, and we don't just provide one service. How does that, tell me about that evolution?
That's a great question. And it's something that I think entrepreneurs really need to realize is when is the next step? When is the next step? We got to about 12 or 15 employees. And we started, maybe there were more, maybe there were about 20. And they started the drawdown in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we knew that this GWAP money was not going to last forever. And we knew that, diversification was a religion for me, right? Because you never want to depend on any one customer. That's just a recipe for failure. So we realized that we needed to start diversifying stateside. And at the time, we had a mentor at Deloitte Consulting, Greg Pellegrino, great guy. We used to meet with him every 6 months through a program that he started with no particular aim other than to just create relationships with small growing businesses. And he would tell us, we used to call it business therapy. We would say, these are the problems we're facing, and he would give us advice. And one piece of advice that he gave us when we brought up this, diversifying the portfolio was, you really need to look at M&A. And our response was, M&A. I mean, come on, we're doing a couple $100,000 a year. We're not M&A ready. He said, no, think about M&A in terms of individuals. You should think about engaging someone who has a particular area of expertise that can get you into a new market. And sure enough, that's what we did. We hired a lovely woman, Christine Abrams, and she opened up the State Department for us on a contract that it's quite possible that the company is still executing on. We had it for years and years and years. We beat Deloitte, and this had nothing to do with the mentor. He wasn't involved, so it wasn't personal. But we found out later that they were one of the competitors, and that started opening up the diversification for us. And then we had, by virtue of the fact that we were working on all of these overseas bases, our circle of clients was constantly moving between places too, because they're only allowed to stay there for 3 years and then they need to go to another position. And that was really a wonderful way to just kind of pollinate the company all over the world and in all these different commands. We hired someone that had relationships at DIA and that got us a DIA contract. We eventually got into a whole bunch of different commands within DoD based on the relationships of the people that we hired.
Yeah, so it was you by de facto, you had all these people working in business development with that being part of their title. I mean, you had a very unique workforce. So you had these connections just because that's who you hired. So that's interesting. So you probably didn't have a real need for someone to business develop other than yourself.
Well, we did. So Christine Abrams, the woman that brought us into the State Department, indeed, her job was business development.
Okay.
But with respect to the other DoD commands, for the most part, I would say, I read a book early on when we were growing, Good to Great. Have you read it?
Oh, yeah, that one I actually have read.
So Good to Great,
right?
the concept in Good to Great is that every company that outperforms its industry, the way that it does it is by being extremely explicit about its values and its metrics. So I came up with this idea of credibility, right? Because we weren't looking to make the top dollar. We weren't looking to squeeze every penny. We were looking for perpetuity. We were looking for continuity. And so by definition, because we were looking for growth. And we thought, okay, growth, but growth in a responsible, ethical way. And so our metric became credibility, and everything within the company, and I'm very proud of this, became measured on the basis of credibility. So in Good to Great, they had an example of, I want to say it was Walgreens, right, where the metric was upselling. The metric of success for every store, for every salesperson, for every whatever is how much you upsell someone who comes into the store for one thing. That worked really well for them and made them outperform their industry. The metric for a sheet metal company was how many sheets of metal they could put out in a certain amount of time. Our metric was credibility. How did we measure that? How much did the client trust you? Right? How much did you deliver what you say or over deliver what you said? How much did your peers rely on you and trust you? All of these different things. It was almost the opposite of the traditional sales mantra that you give to your employees. But at the same time, what it gave our employees, and you have to remember, they're coming out of a pool of fairly idealistic people that believe in this country and believe in what their spouses are doing, are very much looking out for their spouse's own safety and perpetuity. And this was a really comfortable metric for our employees. And it was one that they could take to heart and feel really good about. All of us went to sleep every night thinking we were doing something really good. We're making a living, but we were also building something good rather than tearing something down. And I think for our particular labor force, that was really powerful. It also resonated, and I imagine you're going to ask me about this later, when we got our first contract with Special Operations Command and all of a sudden had to bring aboard 171 former special operators. They're never former, they're soft for life. But the mantra of credibility really, really resonated with them. And for our particular labor pool, I do think that was our magic.
Love it. Yeah, a couple of things I want to touch on there. Like, you grew all this time through a lot of, not all, sole source contracts. You You had the market, yet you didn't take that opportunity to overcharge.
Yes.
You charge enough that you could pay yourselves, make sure you pay with the benefits that you needed to pay, which in that case, not a lot, because all your military spouses. So the military benefits are very generous. So you knew that's not a huge expense. And then a modest profit to help, and G&A to help.
And you saw our profits, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I did.
Yeah.
So, but you were able to modestly grow, and you there's so much criticism out there. All these companies that are sole sourcing, they're out there fleecing the government. It's like, no. You clearly set it out and said, look, we're going to do this and do this right and do this with integrity. And I think that was a huge calling card for WWC Global.
Credibility, that was our brand.
Yeah. So that stuff shows up in CPARS and in past performances. It comes up all the time. You're rated, there's only like 5 categories, like you got delivery and performance, and and there's only those handful of categories. And so, for the contracting officer or core to write up, hey, whatever we gave to the WWC employees, they were over delivering, and like that continues on. So when you started moving to the competitive landscape, they pulled all that in, and there must have been like, I don't know where these folks came from, but holy crap, I need some of that.
We got some beautiful CPARS reviews, and we particularly got really high marks for compliance because that was something that we did from the very beginning. It ended up very quietly building the value of the company. Compliance is a lot of work, and compliance is really easy, frankly, to sidestep when you're little and on nobody's radar. But we did it anyway, just because that's how I was trained. I came out of a law firm. Member of the bar, not going to risk anything, and a little square, probably a little square. I've learned that in the last couple of years that I'm very square. But it ended up, look, I know people that have built companies in 5 years, $500 million companies in 5 years. My hat is off to them. They're incredible. I knew they were fairly ruthless financially, lovely people, but they did what they needed to do to build the company and to build revenue. It just wasn't my style. And I think that makes me not a killer and not a shark and not all of that. I'm all about slow and steady. And so when we went to sell, I think this is when the proof was really in the pudding, because, they talk about the valley of death with small businesses, where small businesses have nowhere to go at a certain point, because either they start competing with the big firms, and they can't compete with the big firms because they grow out of their size status, or they have to sell. Well, when they turn around and they have to sell, a lot of small business owners are surprised to find that what they thought they had, they don't actually have, right? Because how do we value companies? We value them by multiples of their profit. However, once you get valued on a multiple of your profit, the next step is for your buyer to go through all of your inner workings and say, oh, well, that's a risk. I'm going to, decrement this much money for that. And, oh, you misrepresented that, so I'm going to decrement this much money for it. And, I don't know, and this is too risky for me, because what you've actually shown me is, particularly for companies that very brave pioneers, cowboys that go out on the fly, you'll find that what they've done in the past can be a bucket of liabilities. And a large corporate entity is not interested in that. The last thing they want to do is buy risk. They want to buy certainty, the opposite. So when we had our due diligence done, and largely thanks to you as well, on our books, on our compliance, on our systems, on all of the different types of audits, and we were getting audited all the time by, if you do business with DOD, it's like a full-time job to get audited. We had no findings, 0 findings in 18 years. And they couldn't believe it. And so then after the financial due diligence, they sent us to the Toffler company, which did due diligence on our contracts to make sure that we'd appropriately represented and blah, blah, blah. And Toffler came back and said, we've never seen a company this clean. Now, what does this mean? My staff was incredible. Incredible. We had the most unbelievable, and these are people that had started working on contract and moved up to support me in the compliance function. They were brilliant, including our second hire, Gene, the Harvard, Yale trained lawyer that was our that couldn't get a job because they told her she could be a paralegal. But so thanks to our staff, thanks to a lot of wonderful configuration, thanks to having done it right from the very beginning instead of having to try to retrofit, we ended up being, I think, one of the few companies that, in the negotiations when we got bought, we ended up getting paid exactly what the offer was. There was nothing to decrement. So not only that, but the sale ended up going through. A lot of sales don't go through when the buyer looks under the hood. So this is one of those long-term vision things that, the culture of the company is going to impact. And someone that wants to sell eventually needs to think about setting things up right. Never more so than now when everything is totally checkable by AI, by all the systems, everything is automated. When we started, it wasn't. And then, to be clear, when we started during the GWAT era, all of our contracts were competitively won. It's just we were the only ones that were able to provide this service at this price point reliably. Everybody else was still using the old model of pricing. What happened was in around 2008, the Obama administration came in. Everybody had war fatigue. Everybody was worried about the recession. As you recall, it was a real estate bust and all that. Yeah. So there were a lot of efforts and a lot of very blunt efforts to cut the budgets of the commands by 10%, and then they would take those cuts wherever they could. What that ended up doing, I think, is really a poor method for DoD to make its cuts. I think they should have tried to do them more surgically. But then again, I've never tried to do this on such an enormous enterprise. So, I understand the dynamics behind that idea. You assume that people are going to cut, the 10% of fat. But what they ended up doing was simply trying to drive down prices 10% from all of the contractors. And if you were a contractor that wasn't compliant, and if you were a contractor that made promises and sometimes delivered and sometimes didn't, then you would win contracts. If you were a contractor like us that gave the price that would assure that you would get the service and that it would be compliant, you started having a really hard time competitively. And as the drawdown was happening, you had a lot of former active duty troops starting their own companies and saying, yeah, I can do this. I'm the Mark, Dave, and Tom company. And they'd go, all of these guys that we're bringing to the government, they already have pensions from the military. They don't need our health insurance. We don't need to price that in. So, we'll pay them $100,000 and we'll charge $130,000 for them, which you can absolutely do without compliance. And so they were making all these representations in the contracts that they're compliant with this and compliant with that and compliant with labor law. And there was a wonderful, actually, there was a lawsuit brought against Blackwater for the fact that they had mischaracterized employees as contractors and as a result had avoided having to pay for their benefits and all that stuff. As long as you stay out of the regulations of other federal agencies, you can do this really easily. But then the tide rolls out and everybody sees who's been swimming without a bathing suit. And that eventually happened as well. At this time in 2007, 2008, we were fortunate enough to apply for and get 8A status, which at that point, so this is 4 or 5 years, maybe even a couple more years after that, into operations, now we suddenly got the small disadvantaged business designation that did allow us to do sole sourcing. And that, frankly, got our company through that very challenging period of time because we were able to continue to provide the same kind of people we were providing with the same kind of representations and assurances that we were providing in a way that was sustainable. And that really got us through that very rough period until things eased up again. And then we were able to compete at a retail price rather than a price that almost guaranteed failure.
Yeah. Yeah, you're sustaining yourself at the time. I'm glad you're telling this story, Donna. This is very analogous to 2025, right? Huge cuts going on across the board. But you're sitting here just talking about how you pivoted, how you found, all right, what's the way I can sustain myself? Oh, let me hurry up and work on this 8A certification so I can lock in getting sole source awards instead of continuing to scrape and hopefully find other things. So, I think that's a great lesson learned for today is, don't just keep doing what you're doing. You need to be able to change.
Yeah. Well, and to be clear, I mean, again, when I'm seeing people build companies in 5 years and they're being sold for $500 million, I'm thinking, well, maybe I should have cut some corners. Maybe I'm too square, and I probably am. But this is how, you're wired the way you're wired. I was not going to sign on to a representation I couldn't back up with reality.
Coming from a CPA, I feel the same.
Yeah, right? We're the dorks.
So you're not going to find any dispute from me. But I think that's a well worth thing to flesh out a little bit more. Let's talk, how did you know that the future of this company is something that's going to grow into value? How did you develop the exit strategy, I guess is what I want to ask. When did you know with your fellow shareholders that there's only so far I can take this company?
Well, we did stand to lose the 8A designation and face that valley of death. So we knew that we needed to find a solution. Now, there were a couple of different ways of thinking about this. I think initially, some of the internal evaluations that, we all came up with, some of them I thought were financially supportable and some of them were not. So I ran the numbers and looked at book value and enterprise value and came up with, okay, enterprise value is X, book value is Y. And frankly, they were very similar, right? Because we could have continued to run out our contracts that we had. They were fairly lucrative contracts and would have been wildly lucrative if we had stopped the business development efforts and all of that. That would have freed up a lot of extra profit. And so the fact that there were such similarities between those gave me the confidence to know this is what the company is worth. It was and what the company, the way that I valued the company was on a very modest valuation. In other words, it was half of the going multiple at the time for a commercial company. And those two numbers matched. They made sense mathematically. And in fact, we ended up getting within 5% of the number that I had put together that we needed. And again, this was based on the current profit. It was based on the pipeline and the expected win rate of the pipeline. It was very, very mathematically based and also consonant with what the book value of the company was. So I went in with a very good sense of what would make it worth it to sell the company. I was also ready to sell the company. It was an amazing ride. Loved it. I loved the early years. And in the latter years, and I think you learn about yourself, right? There are people who continue to grow and continue to be entrepreneurs, and they want to scale and scale and scale. And for me, and my mentor, who's a 2-star general, told me this, at a certain point, your whole job becomes just fielding problems and making decisions between bad and worse. And that's what it was like. And also having to keep the controls on things. You asked me, how did we build the value? We were extremely, extremely disciplined about pricing, extremely disciplined about money for eventualities and leaving wiggle room. And a lot of times, frankly, we had to dip into that for eventualities that I didn't see coming. That, so-and-so is going to expect a salary of X, but it turns out so-and-so expects a salary of 2X, and we have to keep so-and-so because the client, da-da-da. So, so there were a lot of contracts, and you and I worked on pricing our biggest one, the SOCOM contract. And that one was really interesting. There were a lot of assumptions that went into it. It was a robust contract with a completely reasonable profit. But then we had to adjust because after we won the contract, we found out all sorts of surprise things that the client expected. As a small business, you deliver. You deliver. You don't have a choice. So it turns out that, some assumptions that had been made, fortunately, we built in just enough wiggle room to make this contract work. And And that ended up allowing us to get to really scale up on our internal systems. We put in, formal financial system. You know about that. You helped us through it. My incredible controller, Brenda Fryer, helped us through it. Amazing team that started to, automate and routinize and bring the operations to a more and more sophisticated level, and then allowed us to compete competitively on the kinds of contracts that required all of this very sophisticated compliance. So we use that SOCOM contract really as a building opportunity. We didn't take the money. We didn't run away and run yachts. We took it as a building opportunity. We took it as a building opportunity and said, okay, here are the systems that we need to get to the next level. And the next level was really fun, and the next level, and the next level. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't fun anymore because it's all problems. Right? Because all the good stuff everybody else was doing, right? And especially as the person at the controls, right? The one that had to make sure that we're not losing money and that we're not getting sued and that we're not X, Y, and Z. I ended up being the person that was the no person, and that wasn't fun. So,
yes, unfortunately, someone's got to be that. I mean, when you're growing that fast, and now you're making tens of millions of dollars a year in revenue and multiple business lines, right? There were, 3 segments at the time?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a lot of different issues, and you're far from being that front end person. So you're delegating a lot of authority. You want to get back to another Jim Collins ism. You had the right people on the bus.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
So that's really helped with things. And so now with that diversification came that growth. So, all right. So let's talk about the sales process. You make it sound a little too easy, Donna.
Oh, easy? It was not.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Easy, it was not.
And to someone who you talked a lot, like you were all about credibility. You said that multiple times, and I'm sure when you all wanted to sell, you weren't just going to sell out to the biggest dollar and let them take your people, take your contracts, and have a nice day. Like, you're a huge proponent of the military spouses and expats that you supported and had so many as employees. You had this great reputation that you built literally hands-on.
Yeah.
So, keeping that all in mind, and you'd like to make a couple extra shekels. I'll put that term out there. You wanna do well. You still want to get a nice payday. If you don't want to deal with the pain. So how do you balance all of that when you're going through this process? Like the who, the what, the where.
Yeah.
Like, how do you get there?
There were, when you sell, and I think entrepreneurs should be ready for that, there's going to be lots of people that are going to tell you that you're worth less than you are. And that's the game. There are going to be, I can tell you, for example, a classic, IB trick is at the very last minute to say, oh, oops, the valuation was wrong. Oh, oops, it's going to be less. And then, your seller is already so invested in selling and has already pictured themselves on vacation that they go, okay. I just stuck to the numbers. And the numbers told me what this company was worth. Fortunately, we had a buyer that was willing to pay what the company was worth. The buyer, thank God, culturally, the buyer was really, I want to say, one of only 2 companies that we would have sold to because of their culture. We sold to a Native American firm. And these people are the most lovely people and absolutely blew my mind with this tribal ethic that money is not even money. Money is not part of their culture, right? That resources are there to be shared. They were so giving. They were amazing. I remember a couple of times on policy issues when I was representing small businesses and working with them that, things came up that, you had a fixed pie and some people were going to get more or some people were going to get less depending on, how they arranged it. And they said, we don't play that game. There's more for everybody. There's enough for everybody. I was blown away by the sincerity and the authenticity of these incredible people. And I thought, this really reminds me of the culture that we have because we were never pigs, right? We never, the founders never took their money out until the thing was sold. I mean, we lived in the same house and drove the same Hondas and whatever. So culturally, it was a beautiful fit. There were actually two tribes that we talked to at the last minute that we really liked. And one of them just ended up having better terms. But in terms of function, I think what I recognized and I held on to was they wanted to buy us for our sales. And of course they do, right? Because you've got a book of business and then everybody wants that. But what they really wanted, because we were going to fall out of 8A status, right? And the sales were going to go to their other small businesses. They recognized that we had built a really powerful engine, that we had built a really robust, automated system with all the bells and whistles that the FAR requires. And as you know, the FAR is 1,000 pages long. So we'd actually done it. We had done it, and everything they poked at turned out well. There was again, one of these situations where it was like, there's a discrepancy here. When the government had asked for 2 different reporting things at 2 different times in 2 different ways, that was like the only thing that ever came up. But we built it. We had the engine. It was plug and play, and they were buying a lot of other small businesses. So what they really bought us for was to be a platform. And they needed us. We needed them. It was a beautiful dovetailing. And so I have to say that from that perspective, it was an absolute huge success. I think we got a fair price. I hope that our buyers think that they got what they paid for. And it's going really well. I mean, they grew it after we sold it. We sold it 350 people. They're up to 500 people. There are a couple of USAID contracts that got canceled. So, when USAID went away, but that happened industry-wide. But they continue to grow it and adapt it and make it their own. And I think they're very successful. I think our employees on the ground continue to be really, really happy. And so we consider that a success. And
yeah, I love the story. And it's lots to be proud of for sure. So let's talk more about, when growing up as that small business, you became this outspoken advocate for small businesses, particularly in government contracting. How did that come about? You went through the pains, and so why did you become so involved with organizations like NDIA and wanting to speak up about the problems that small businesses have?
So this was actually, I'm trying to think, around 2013. I had some downtime in DC. I had a meeting canceled or something, and I saw that there was an NDIA open forum to talk about small business issues. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go to this and see what this is. And my God, I mean, this was, people don't like small business set-asides, and they particularly don't like 8A small business set-asides. They resent them. They think they are not fair. They think they are not in the best interests of the Department of Defense. I knew differently because I knew how my firm functioned. I knew the value that we had brought to the DoD as a small business. I knew how we were brought in as the red button out of the toolbox to fix things really quickly that other companies had messed up. So I went and I stood at the mic, and after, there were all of these people standing to have their say, and everybody was standing up saying how awful it is that there's set-asides for small business and stuff. And I went up there and I said, listen, small business has its time and place. Whether or not you agree with the social agenda behind the set-asides, and particularly the 8A set-asides, you can't reject the fact that they are an amazingly important tool in the toolbox, that they are really critical for the defense industrial base, and particularly for a DoD that wants to keep, that edge. Innovation comes from small businesses. It does. And it's not just technical innovation. It's management innovation, which was, in our case, it was management innovation. Mm-hmm. All sorts of innovation. And you keep your industrial base fresh and dynamic, and you compete with your near peers, not by squashing what's new, but by integrating what's new. And I'm not a fan of setting something aside for 8A small business just because, right? But I'm certainly a fan of what 8As and small businesses bring to the table that large businesses simply don't. The primary among them being that they're not answerable to shareholders. And in everything that we did, I told you about our metric, credibility. That was because we didn't have to increase profits year over year. We had up years, we had down years, we didn't care. We made a living. And whatever extra went into investments, you're not going to find that with a large firm. You're not going to find that with a firm that answers to shareholders, because the shareholders are never satisfied. They're always with their mouth open for more. And that has to come from somewhere. And if it doesn't come from more revenue, it's going to come from less delivery. I'm sad to say it, but this is the way business works. Small businesses are not subject to these rules, especially certain small businesses. And I'm a passionate advocate of that. My husband also is a mergers and acquisitions guy. And he told me, and I've seen it a lot, that, some of the best technology comes out and then it never makes it to the marketplace because the megaphone isn't big enough, And big business has every incentive to squash competition, and perfectly legitimately, right? This is what they're legally mandated to do. They're legally mandated to do one thing and one thing only: increase shareholder value. How do you do that? You keep out competition or you buy them. And that's completely legitimate. And if I were running a large business, that's exactly what I would do. But I'm not sure that that is so great for the defense industrial base. And people lose sight of it. Particularly what I found is in government, people that haven't worked in these firms. And it's interesting because once they do work in these firms, they get all these heuristics and make generalizations in one way or another. If somebody had a bad experience at a certain large firm, they're going to, say, oh, large firms are terrible. And if somebody had a good experience at a small firm, they're going to say, oh, small firms are wonderful. There's a variety of experiences. And it's incumbent on the Department of Defense to incentivize the right kind of behavior among its contractors. What has happened traditionally is small businesses don't have much of a voice. And the large businesses will say, they're terrible. You see that they're terrible, right? We bring them to you and they're terrible and they fail. A lot of that is true. But a lot of that is true when you approach small businesses by saying, oh, you're going to be my cheapest option. Well, go for the cheapest option. Sometimes you don't even get what you paid for. You get less.
Yeah.
So I always like to say, the government, the contracting officer thinks the government needs a Honda. Customer thinks he needs Cadillac. They end up putting out a solicitation without knowing it that's really asking for, a Kia. And then they end up getting a pogo stick because of what they don't ask for and what they don't include in the specifications. So I think it's really an art, like everything else in business and like everything else in policy. It's an art to incentivize the best players to come in. There needs to be a space, I think, for companies that are not shiny and glittery, but continue to deliver well year over year over year. I don't think there's much interest in that, right? Everyone's looking for this next sexy widget. But the government really needs these small individual run firms. They need them because they're reliable. They know what they're going to get. And as much as I admire the large firms, there's incredible talent within the large firms. Very often, the government engages a large firm and they think they're getting something, and that's not what they're getting. Not necessarily through the fault of the large firm, oftentimes through the fault of the procurement process that didn't take in certain things into account. A small business is going to please you no matter what. Even if you didn't write X, Y, and Z into the contract, they're going to make sure you're happy. And I do think that there's a very important place for that within the government. And I think there's a very important place for small organizations where all of the employees, everyone that's on staff is going to be in your offices, has a sense of ownership of the outcome as opposed to just punching the clock. So again, I will scream this from the rooftops. I think small businesses are absolutely critical. I think there are smart ways to integrate small business contracts into the defense industrial base, and there are ways that are less effective. And I love helping the government think about how to distinguish between the two.
I love it. Yeah, it's not all only about lowering the barriers to entry, but it's also incentivizing government buyers that take a chance. It's fine to let out some money and that company fails at it. They're going to learn from that and develop something even better as a result of that failure. Failure is not a bad thing in the innovation space. So now we have all these great programs, whether SBIR, the AFWorks, InQtels, all these little incubators that want to say, hey, listen, little company, like, what are you doing in this new encryption technology or whatever it may be? It's critical. So what do you see? I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot. Like, what should DoD or the government as a whole be doing to incentivize a small business? There's a big attack, especially right now. Do we really need these set asides? Do we need the hub zones? Do we need the 8As? Like, how do we continue to keep small business relevant and moving forward?
Yeah. Wow, there's a couple of different things. I mean, the first would be, another mantra. If our, mantra at the company was credibility, my mantra for the government would be fewer regulations consistently enforced. The number of requirements that create a barrier to entry to do business in the federal marketplace are frankly almost impossible for a small business unless they have someone like me who has both a legal and a financial background. It's a whole other job. It's a whole other skill set that you can't, you have someone who's a brilliant inventor or a brilliant operator. You can't expect them to also understand labor law and accounting and all of these other things. It's just simply too much for a small business. By the same token, what you have in this area is you very frequently have people say, hey, I can do this. They ignore everything. They sign whatever is put in front of them. They deliver the product, but then when something blows up, all of a sudden you realize, oh, they didn't have the evacuation insurance. They said that they had, oh, actually, they weren't paying what they said they were paying. And so the employee is not coming into work. And, there's no enforcement of this. There is, at least as of 2 years ago when I left the industry, there was zero enforcement at small business level of this. And these are the basic things that should actually be enforced and not just at a threshold of dollar value, because what you're doing is a number of things. If you don't enforce them all the way through from the small business level, all the way to the giant, oligopoly level, then you are incentivizing revenue to go to the bad actors that lie about what they're doing. And you are setting them up to continue to move up in government. And the regulations exist for a reason, right? If you have a company that is not actually CMMC compliant, and keep in mind, CMMC has only now started being enforced. Since 2017, nobody ever checked. Okay, so I'll tell you a story of what happened when we implemented our CMMC system, when we got our first big contract in 2018. We rolled it out all over the world and overnight. And then we woke up in the morning and our vice presidents were screaming angry. They're like, this system is terrible. Our IT department is terrible. My phone doesn't work, et cetera, et cetera. So, So our IT director went in there and checked to see what was happening. She opened up the program and saw that overnight there had been 88 error messages. And when she shrank it down, she saw that the 88 error messages were all associated with our vice president's phones. And when she looked even closer, she identified that there were these repeat hacking attacks from, South Korea and Estonia trying to hack into our VP's phones. Now, this was at a time when it had just been announced publicly in newspapers and in the Federal Register that we, a small 8A, had just been awarded a $200 million contract for SOCOM. So, of course, we were a great, rich target. And, our competitors, our enemies are going to get into us through human behavior, and particularly human behavior in unenforced areas. They're going to try to pick out the weakest link. If you don't have enforcement at all levels, you're creating a weakest link. You're essentially making a map to tell your enemy where to go to get into the government to create havoc. So the question was how to work with small businesses. Yes. Reduce the barriers to entry by having fewer regulations. Really, only a few are really, truly critical. Okay. Here's what's critical. You need transparency, you need cybersecurity, you need to comply with labor laws, and you need to have safe personnel engaged. I think those are the biggies. I'm probably missing some, but there really aren't that many biggies.
And it shouldn't be that onerous. That it really should be. Everyone complains, oh, I have to pay for all that. It's like, yeah, if you want to serve the defense, intel, all these communities where you have personal identifying information or other information that could potentially impair our security,
Yeah.
That's sort of the cost of doing business. Stop complaining, build it as part of your price. I mean, easier said than done, and I get it. And some people are, again, but I got to make this as cheap as possible. I get it. But like, to your point, you stand by with that credibility, that value. They'll pay the price to make sure it stays safe.
And don't take companies at face value when they say, yes, I've complied with everything in this 40-page T's and C's. You know, unless you check it, you're not going to know. And I'm not a big fan of auditing people to death. But if you make if you constrain the audits to just the thing that matters, let's say the 5 things that matter, then I think you're really creating an even playing field that will yield you really good players instead of a race to the bottom. And so to your point, I actually remember I was on a panel in front of a couple of government executives during the first Trump administration, and we had one of the defense secretaries at the time, and again, talking about cybersecurity and CMMC. And I remember him saying, well, listen, every company has already priced this into their overhead. We don't need to be paying more for it. And I said, come visit me in my small business community, and you'll see that I'm the only one that has priced this into my overhead. It's simply not true. You know, standard practice for large businesses, that large risk-averse businesses, is extremely different from standard practice for startups that, you know, move fast and break things. Yeah. And the government needs to recognize that. It needs to stop looking to small business as its low-cost option. It needs to understand that sometimes even in small businesses, overhead is higher because you just have a smaller pool to sort of peanut butter and across.
Exactly. Exactly right. Yeah.
One last pitch, actually, for small business is, you know, anyone that's worked out in the commercial world knows that with, you know, all these conglomerates and mergers and everything, that the distance between the CEO and the frontline employee is growing ever increasingly large. And a lot of people want to get off that Ferris wheel. A lot of people that came to work for us at a small business were really superstars within their large firms, but they wanted a different environment. They wanted to feel like part of something. They didn't want to feel like a cog in the wheel. And I think that this is the other hidden advantage of small business that the government should appreciate, especially when you're looking for professional services. You don't necessarily need a huge company. You can have a small boutique firm. I mean, the commercial markets do this all the time. You might go to a really large firm for an enormous law case, or you might go to a tiny niche firm because they specialize in one thing, or they have one guy that does something fantastic in there. And so, again, this is another reason why I wouldn't paint all small businesses with a large brush. I'd be more sophisticated and take a microscope and be a little more surgical in how I incentivize my small business contracting.
I love it. I love it. I hope people are hearing you out on all these issues, and we're very lucky to have you within that community still advocating. So speaking of which, you know, now that you've sold, you're out in community, you know, traveling the globe, but you're still staying very active within the GovCon community. So what are you doing now? What's keeping you busy? You know, what issues are you What issues are you advocating for besides the ones you just talked about, or other companies that you're looking to help? You know, talk a little bit about that.
So I've been continuing to, I've been mentoring a number of small businesses, especially defense tech startups in Israel and elsewhere internationally. These days, the best technology does not just come out of the United States, and it certainly doesn't just come out of sort of the crucible of the DoD. We have a lot of situations where really we're going to need to start looking towards our allies for innovations, because they're coming from everywhere and we need to keep up. Otherwise, our enemy is going to buy them in cash on the spot without a procurement process, and we lose. One of the things that I got involved with a couple of people that do business in Australia and in the UK, and I had a little bit of an insight here in Israel when I was doing a sabbatical here that I thought was going to be a vacation that ended up being very much a working vacation once war broke out. One of the things that we were working on was trying to endorse kind of a superhighway kind of thing to the Department of Defense to make sure that they can cull the best of worldwide innovation, especially, you know, here in Israel, because of the ongoing conflicts. There's constant evolution. You know, drone technology, for example, in the battles in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Ukraine, right? our procurement system cannot keep up with the pace of the evolution of the technology, because literally there's an innovation every 2 months. Every 2 months, you're fighting with a different thing that you've taped a different thing onto it. I mean, most of the fighting is being done with commercial the shelf products that are being adopted with duct tape, with this, with that sensor, with whatever. If the government isn't able to keep up with this purchasing, God forbid, if we have a conflict with China or Russia, we will always be on the last generation technology, and that is terrible for combat outcomes. So I was working on that. While I was working on that, I learned, to my great delight, that as compared to some other ministries of defense in some other countries, our U.S. DoD is incredibly self-aware and incredibly proactive in reducing those barriers to innovation. What I found is that they've really hit the gas. The DoD has really hit the gas on programs like SBIR, other transactional authorities, DIU as a funnel to get the best of technology. And I think they're doing really great without my help. Thank you very much. So no. I'm really, really proud of our country, because these problems persist in other systems and in other countries. And it's really dangerous, right? When you have a near peer competitor, an enemy that is not bound by their own regulations and not bound by any limitations in who they can buy from and how quickly, you're really in jeopardy if you don't reform your system. I frankly think there's room for reform in other countries within their procurement systems.
Always.
So crazy enough, like, we are standing as the model right now worldwide for, reducing those barriers and opening ourselves up for innovation, no matter where it comes from. And so what I'm doing now is I'm working with certain other companies. I've got a couple of projects that are going on particularly in the drone, UAV, counter UAV space. That again, there's no end of opportunity there, because every 2 months you have a new technology.
It's fantastic. Yeah. Well, they're very lucky to have you, Donna. I'm very lucky to have you here on this podcast. You talk a lot about some of the things I picked up on. Diversification is religion. You're growing your GovCon. You can't just concentrate on one customer. You can't just concentrate on one service. I mean, it's great to be that special niche provider, but that quickly goes out of favor with a new administration or new secretary within that organization. You're going to find yourselves on the out. So we got to be open to trying something that different, whether it's from a customer or service point of view. You shared one of your mentors' 3 main points of being a great executive, setting the vision, knowing how to allocate resources, and then training those to replace you. I think that was also some great takeaways from today. Donna, I really appreciate you coming on with me. This has been really great as always. I love talking with you. Everyone who's listening, please, give us some feedback. Find us on LinkedIn, leave some comments. We can continue this discussion. Donna, you and I can, we're going to have lunch someday soon. We'll keep talking about all this. This is a big time of change here in the U.S. There's lots of change, obviously, going on in your neck of the woods there. And I want you to continue, please, staying safe and doing what you can to help our allies there to help keep yourself and the rest of us all safe on that end. So thank you for all that you do, for standing up for small business, standing up for innovation, standing up for reform. I mean, it's all necessary.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. There's something I feel that I would be remiss if I didn't mention, and I wish we had gotten to it during the interview. I just want to mention that you were my secret weapon in winning our $200 million contract at SOCOM. We had a pricing expert that was supposed to work for us. It turns out she was working for our competition without mentioning it. At the last minute, my husband said, you got to talk to Jeff. I talked to Jeff. You and I spent the next 37 hours on the phone together and put together the winning pricing and the winning bidder in a very, very, as you remember, convoluted pricing exercise. And ever since then, we really tried to take advantage of every tool that was available for us in pricing and in compliance. And every time I ran into a question I couldn't answer, I would bug you. sometimes at dinner time, sometimes delivering your kids, and you were always just wonderfully responsive. And I've apologized routinely to your wife for taking you away from your life. But you always had a very informed answer. You have X-ray vision with the numbers. I mean, I thought I had X-ray vision. You were just incredible. And I just want to recommend Cohn Resnick and your support for anybody that wants to get it right.
That's very sweet of you. Thank you. I loved working with the folks at WWC Global. I learned lots from you as well. And that's how it's supposed to be. This GovCon community cannot succeed without the support of others. This is why I love hosting this podcast and having insights like yours share with everyone. I mean, you cannot do this alone. You cannot just go on to a bulletin board or
right.
any other website and be like, oh yeah, I can figure out this new environment. These new regulations that are coming out, whatever, no big deal. Now it is. And we're all going to be figuring it out together.
Yes.
And so, sharing these resources is more important than ever right now.
I agree. It's a great community and wonderful to have people like you in it.
Yeah, it's very sweet. Well, Donna, thank you so much. I look forward to talking more again. Thanks for everyone for listening.
Bye-bye.